Hello, folks, and welcome to Author Adjacent, a podcast about the journey from hobbyist writer to professional author. I'm your host, Michael Vadney, and today I have another author bonus interview. I'm sitting here with Adam Fernandez, author of Vermilion Flames. Welcome to the show, Adam.
Hi, thanks for having me, guys. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for coming. It's really awesome that you're here. To get us started off, why don't you give us like a little blurb about the book that you're in, your debut novel, for the people that might not be familiar with your work?
Sure, yeah. So Vermilion Flames is a science fiction space opera. It is based in our solar system, so you'll see a lot of, familiar places as you start reading, but it's set pretty far in the future from our present time. Yeah. So essentially you're following Kaya and Silas kind of through their adventures in the story where, Silas is a sort of old-timey military commander. Kaya is a young nobleman's daughter. And essentially, they are both sort of find themselves in situations where they're dealing with the established government that is, in both their views, maybe not doing the best that it could for the people. And then you sort of start seeing, as that develops into a larger scale rebellion through the story, and sort of their parts in both of it, coming from both sides of the conflict. And kind of as their paths intertwine throughout the story.
Yeah, it's a really cool book. I'm glad I got the chance to listen to it. I actually did it over audiobook, which I was very fortunate. You got someone that was very talented. I'm sorry I don't know their name, but they did an excellent job.
Yeah, Eden Gabai was the narrator, and he's fantastically talented. He, really did an amazing job of bringing the story to life.
Nice. How did you come along to making an audiobook for it? Like, how did you go out and go about the process of creating it and finding this narrator for your book?
Sure. So, well, first off, an audiobook was a non-negotiable for me. I knew from the beginning that this story needed to have an audiobook. I personally really enjoy audiobooks a lot. So I knew that was something I wanted to do. And then, basically once the book was totally done and published and everything was finished, I then started looking into how I was going to handle the actual logistics of doing the audiobook. I ended up going through ACX, which is essentially Amazon's, audiobook service. So essentially they kind of serve as the middleman between you and between the author and the narrators. And essentially you post up what your project is, that you're looking for narrators, you set your budget and the terms and sort of the businessy side of it. And then essentially narrators apply to, they audition to narrate your book.
Oh, that's really cool. Actually, I've heard of this service, but I've never really talked to someone that's used it and then like the nuts and bolts of it. So those are really useful insights. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, it was, for me, it was the first time I had done it before, and I wasn't familiar with it until I started doing it. But it was actually a lot of fun too from my end, because, suddenly you feel like kind of like a movie director trying to, pick the right voice for your story, and, somebody that's going to kind of, because especially with, not to go on too much of a tangent, but with audiobooks in general, I think.
We're here for tangents. Go for it.
All right. Awesome. Because with audiobooks in general, right, I mean, I think the narration can really make or break a story, or how you're going to get, engrossed in it, right? So, like, if the narrator's not right for the tone the author intends, it could throw off the whole book, right? It's not gonna listen right. So, that was sort of the hardest part, I think, for me as the author trying to pick the narrator was, a lot of people were very, very talented and they submitted great auditions. But it was finding that person that just really had the tone just right. And Eden nailed it, like right from the beginning, really. And it was also a huge advantage that he has a very wide range of accents.
Yeah. Especially in like fantasy and sci-fi. And he did a really great job with both like the male and female voices.
Yes.
And you're totally right. Like the narration of an audiobook can really augment your enjoyment of it. I'm not going to say what the book is because I don't want to be throwing shade or anything, but I remember I got all the way through the book and I really enjoyed the book, but because of the tone that a lot of the phrases were set in, and like there was just a very sultry voice that was being used in scenes that I'm like, this is not a sultry scene. It definitely was a little off-putting. I got through the book. I enjoyed the book, but it was definitely, it augments your reality of the book a lot.
Yeah, because it can take you out of the moment, right? So,
100%.
yeah, and just sort of part of it. But, luckily, I got a lot of interest in the narration, so I had a lot of different, people to choose from, and which made it hard and great at the same time, so, but it worked out. I'm super happy, and, he should be the one narrating the future audiobooks as well, once the next books in the series come out.
Awesome. So you're spoiled for choice, but it seems like you got a really good egg out of the bat.
Maybe I just got lucky. I don't know, but I'll take it.
Nice. Yeah, we've talked a little bit about this. Ooh, hidden my mic. We talked about this a little bit, like just after I read the book, and just you and I have been going back and forth a little bit about how important audiobooks really have become in the market, and for really just people like us who like to listen to audiobooks for our really long runs. Is that really how you got into like listening to audiobooks, and why that became so important for your book to be an audiobook?
I think so, yeah. I mean, so for me, originally when I got into audiobooks, I just had a super long commute. So I was driving, essentially like an hour plus every day, each way to work and back, before COVID kind of changed everything. But so during that time, I was, spending, at least 10 hours a week in the car. And right there, that's a good sized audiobook. So, essentially I was able to get through, a couple books a week, and really sort of, elevate my, my overall like reading, time, which was awesome. So then, yeah. And then, once I started getting, into a lot more distance running, now it was like, okay, I was commuting and I'm running for an hour a day too. So, and a couple hours on the weekend, I'm like, oh man, now, I'm getting through 2 or 3 books a week. And so for me, I know there's a lot of other people like me that are out there that are, hungry for audiobooks. So I just kind of knew right away that, there just wasn't another option. So for me, when I first even started wanting to write in the first place, the main thing was I wanted to, essentially be my own best customer. So I wanted to write the books that I wanted to listen to. I wanted to make sure that they were available in the format I would have wanted to read them in. So that, definitely colored a lot of my choices, and especially the, going for the audiobook kind of right from the beginning.
Why don't you tell me a little bit about that transition? Like, how did you start becoming a writer and eventually a published author? Like, was there a particular moment that really kicked that off? Or was it something that kind of just turned in the background, and then eventually you're like, all right, let's do this?
So I didn't really have like it's funny because I listen to a lot of other writers kind of talk about how they got started, and a lot of them, will have like a story about how, the story has kicked around in their head for a decade, and, they were always waiting to write it or whatever. But for me, that really wasn't the case. I think I got to a point actually where, I had gotten through, a lot of books, and I kept searching for like sort of that next thing I wanted to read, and nothing was really hitting for me. I'd start a bunch of books and I wouldn't be able to finish them, and I just kind of like felt sort of uninspired with what I was reading. So then I started listening to music again instead of my audiobooks while I was running, and through the course of listening to the music, I started kind of, I've always had a big imagination. I've always been really interested in storytelling, but just not formally in writing per se. But so, in all this sort of empty time I had when I was just kind of like, on the move and working out and whatever, I would start imagining like kind of like scenes, right? It wouldn't be really fully formed narratives or anything like that. It would just be some type of scene or event or something. And, and then I'd start kind of extrapolating out from that and building on it. And, then eventually I kind of got to the point where I was like, maybe I can have a go at this, maybe I'll try to like make some kind of cohesive story out of all of this. And then one day I decided, what, I'm just going to write a scene. Like I had no idea what it was going to be for or about. I was writing purely on vibes. That was it. They were just vibes. There was nothing else going on. There was no plot or anything. I mean, it was, um, and that's just kind of where I started. And I wrote the scene, and and I was like, well, hey, like this actually sounds kind of good. Like I didn't think it was half bad. So then, I started another scene and another, and then I shelved it for a while, and then came back to it maybe like 6 months later, and was really like, you know what, I'm gonna dedicate the proper time to this and see it through. And then that's basically how Vermilion Flames was born.
That's a really cool origin story. Did that first scene ever get into the book?
It did, yeah. So at first, actually, in the very initial draft, it was where I started the book. And then, I kept writing. And then about sort of halfway through the process, well, I'll let you in behind the curtain a little bit. So,
oh, please, that's what we're here for.
Kaya originally was actually never going to be in the story at all. But I started with Silas's point of view. But then I realized, the timelines really weren't going to work, and I needed a perspective in a different time point. And so eventually that's how everything got shifted around. But, the very first scene I wrote ended up being, one of Silas's scenes that ends up in the middle of the book. So you kind of don't always know, I guess, in the beginning where it's going to go. But, for me, I don't have a very like structured process, I guess, because I didn't really go into it with many expectations. So I was very open to sort of changing things around as I got started. And also just let it, it sounds a little cliche, but you let the characters take you where they're going to take you, And I think,
oh, that definitely makes sense.
Once you kind of like get more comfortable in their heads, you start thinking, well, how would they react to this, or what would they do in this situation? And then it really dictates so much of what happens after that.
That's pretty wild that Kaya almost wasn't in the book. Like was it just 100% about Silas at first?
It was, yeah. So 100%, he was the main character. He was sort of the whole storyline. And then, then I had a lot of thoughts about, not only just sort of building out like the sort of relevant details of his story, but also the bigger picture too. So, I mean, now she's an integral part to the whole plot, right? Like it doesn't really work without her, but
oh yeah.
And it makes me think, well, what would I have done if she had never showed up, in the story? I don't know. It probably wouldn't have made a lot of sense, but yeah, I mean, it's just pretty neat how that kind of played out.
It's interesting that she was almost not there, because Kaya is kind of the vehicle in which the reader is introduced to the story and introduced to the world for the most part. Like, this is all just conjecture in my personal opinion, but like, Kaya comes across as like the stronger character at first, and you really learn a lot about the world and everything that's happening. Well, I guess the worlds, since this is a space opera, we're going across a bunch of different areas. But she is the vehicle in which you learn about a lot of this stuff. And then Silas comes in to give you a different part of that world that she has no contact with. And then it's really cool how they both build into their stories in completed isolated areas, and then eventually cross over for these really cool climactic moments. As you can tell, I enjoyed the book a lot.
Well, I appreciate that. Yeah, no, I mean, I appreciate seeing your enthusiasm for it. Yeah, I mean, you nailed it though, exactly, because I tried to keep a very close point of view for the narration. Yeah. Like, I wanted my hands to be, as light as possible on the narrative, so that the characters really were the ones, experiencing everything, and that was purely the vehicle that the readers would know anything. And part of that is practical with Kaya, bringing her in to be able to explain a lot to the reader from, a sort of her perspective, since she is in a lot of ways, ignorant of things that, say, Silas already knows. And it would be unusual to explain in his point of view. So, there was a technical aspect to it, but then also it just kind of worked too. Since they are, very different in a lot of ways too, which is also good for the sake of perspective.
No, that makes a lot of sense. So you mentioned your process earlier is a little like loose and kind of go with the flow. Does that mean you didn't really go through like an outlining process or anything like that? It was just like fully pantsed all the way through?
it would be disingenuous, I think, of me to say it was fully pantsed all the way through. Because there were times where, like, as a scientist, I obviously use an Excel document to keep track of all my writing stuff. So
Yeah, you're a geologist, right?
I am, yeah. So technically a geologist by trade, and so I have this massive spreadsheet going with all sorts of details about characters and dates and names and timelines and things. But also what I do in there too, I'll outline all the chapters of the story. Most of it wasn't filled out right away, but I had sort of a general idea of like the length I was going for, and then kind of once I had a few chapters, then essentially I would go, so I'd go out on one of my runs and I'd start thinking, okay, what's like the next like 2 or 3 chapters, right? And I'd figure that out throughout the course of my exercise. I'd come back home or I'd leave a notepad in the car too, and I'd immediately start jotting down notes about like, okay, this needs to happen next, and then this needs to happen, and that needs to happen, and and then I start plugging in info into the spreadsheet kind of as I go. So it was always maybe like 2 or 3 steps ahead, but not the whole thing.
Yeah.
And then with the Excel, it's easy. You can always move chapters around. So I did that quite a bit too.
Excel and Google Sheets, all those things are incredibly powerful. There's a lot of times where I'm on my run, and like running, you have so much time to think.
Right.
Even if you're listening to something, your mind kind of just wanders. And anytime I get those moments where like there's a story moment that hits me or something that just kind of inspires me in that moment and I need to write it down, I actually take my cell phone out and I send a WhatsApp message to my wife and I just say, note to self, this character does this in the next chapter. This is the reason why. And it kind of like pulls her into the process, because like writing itself can be a very solitary exercise. And it's kind of a nice way to like kind of let her in on the world that I'm experimenting and building out with, so that we can then talk about it later.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Sometimes I'll jot things down, on the notepad app or whatever, and I'll go to my wife once I have a sort of fully baked idea, and then try to get her, her buy-in on it. And that's a great help too. I mean, having somebody close by that you can bounce ideas off of really is huge.
Definitely. Do you have like any kind of like writing group or a writing circle or critique circle, or is it mostly just like you yourself and then bouncing ideas off your wife?
Yeah, it's pretty much just me and my wife, and then the editors I've worked with, which I'm continuing to work with that have been awesome. But outside of that, and the early readers, really, honestly. So
yeah,
I had a couple beta readers, but I didn't really use a tremendous like a big circle of people to really like bounce it off of or anything. I got a lot of good initial feedback, and I felt pretty kind of happy with how it was turning out. So I just sort of stuck with it. And also, I'm really impatient, so I didn't want to like I didn't think I had like the wherewithal to like hand it out to dozens of people and like wait for results and then like edits, and then I was like, oh no, I can't do this. I gotta get it in the world, and what happens.
Yeah, that is impressive, because it is a very well fleshed out book, and the world itself has a lot going on with it. Like there's so many little pieces that really, you think it's just, at first you think, okay, the author put this in here because they think it's really cool and they just kind of want to show off the world a little bit, and then it becomes relevant later and you're like, oh. There were several moments that I caught in that, and I thought that was really cool. So that's really impressive that you didn't really do a lot of feedback on this because of the depth of the story and the depth of the world. Was there any particular thing that really inspired all of this? Like, were there certain books or like movies or games or even just like real world cultures that you're like, okay, I'm going to take that and do my version of it? Or was it all just birth of the mind?
Well, I can't honestly say it's all birth of the mind, right? Because everything that we, consume and experience and everything we've ever learned, it comes through in our writing, I think, whether we want it to or not, or whether we're consciously thinking of it or not.
Valid.
And so actually, like for me growing up, I mostly read a lot of fantasy novels. I grew up basically all like the sort of major 90s fantasy series, all the Robert Jordan books and Terry Goodkind, Raymond E. Feist, like all these books. I would just consume them ravenously at the time, and waiting anxiously for the next one to come out, and then I'd read that, and so for me, like, I never really was a big sci-fi guy. I think, like, at some point, I don't know, I started getting into more of like, I really love time travel books, which I think you talked about on your last show, and I was listening to that, and I was like, yes, like, it was like, time travel books are great. And a lot of what I love about that, though, is sort of the exploration of history too. Like, I'm a big history buff, and any kind of chance I have to do that, I'm interested in too. But so anyway, so, like, all of that stuff kind of has influenced, like, sort of the big picture of what I was trying to do. But I think what really sort of kicked off the idea for Vermilion Flames specifically, I've read a lot of sort of this dystopian type of, space opera, sci-fi space operas. One key element, which I think is always kind of missing a little bit from them, is a discussion of, like, religion and belief and how that impacts culture. So for me, that was sort of, I think, the biggest thing that was different about Vermilion Flames than a lot of other stuff that I've read, is that, I did want to tackle that question of belief a little bit, but from a very, like, neutral perspective. So for anybody that hasn't read the book, the religion, although similar to what people might recognize in the story, is not at all, like, it's totally fictitious. It is not based on any real world religions. But that being said, I think if we were to envision a future world where, that's based on the world that sort of we're all coming from, it'd be hard to imagine that would just disappear, especially in the face of the types of things that, are discussed in the novel, right? So if there's aspects of scientific discoveries that are made in that world, if in fact people are able to live forever, the idea of agelessness that's mentioned in the story, if that does come up, it probably would elicit a different response from different people. Not everybody, I think, would react either positively or, excitedly to that type of, development. So anyway, when I thought of the story, I was like, well, let me think of a world where those types of things haven't changed, right? Like, the rise of AI didn't kill, sort of existential belief. Not, everybody didn't become atheist all of a sudden.
Yeah, a lot of that stuff gets hand waved in, like, space operas.
Yeah, exactly. And I get it, right? Like, that type of story maybe isn't super marketable to a traditional audience. I felt like it's what I would want to read about, so let's give it a try,
Yeah, I also think a lot of times authors avoid the case of religion, mainly because it throws a lot of, like, interesting wrenches in your story. It's a whole nother aspect that you really have to consider among, like, culture and socio-economical standing of your characters, and if they're in different ones, how do that relate to each other? And then if you have religion, there's usually more than one. Like, not everybody worships the same God or worships the same God in the same way.
Sure.
So there's a lot of complexities when people throw that into a story, and I think that can be a little intimidating sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. And, it was difficult for me too in writing it, and what I tried really hard to do was make sure that, each character tackled, their own personal belief in a way that was honest to their life experience and to the way that they saw the world. So really in the story, you get a wide range of characters that react, that deal with it very differently, from one spectrum to the other. What I also tried really hard to do too was, sort of separate the institution from the religion as well in the story. So, it's not instantly like the religious people are bad and the not religious people are good. It's totally not that at all. It's, like in real life, there's, you get a wide spectrum of people everywhere. They believe all sorts of different things. And to me, ultimately, it comes down to, what they decide to do, given, different situations.
When you come across stories that are a lot like that, they do present themselves as very flat, which sometimes there is a time and a place for that. But
sure,
most of the time, people are really more nuanced than that. Society is more nuanced, and any group of people will be.
Sure.
So it makes sense to do it that way. But again, it's more difficult, and I think that is the reason why people tend to avoid it. But I think you did a really good job in this story with it, because there are a lot of really good characters in the church, and like Silas himself is religious as well throughout the story, and how he struggles with that versus like his duty, his faith, his responsibilities as both a husband, a father, a commander. It's just, he has very real problems. I mentioned this before in a previous episode, but just as I'm developing more as a reader and becoming more mature as a reader, I love when characters have like real problems inside this fantastical space, and you definitely delivered on that.
Thank you. Yeah, it was certainly my goal. For me, like the characters make the story, right? They're everything. Like, I tried very hard to make sure that every character was as deep as possible because, they're real people, right? Or they're supposed to be. It takes like kind of a lot of extra time to think about it sometimes, and you don't always need to, at least for me, like I don't always write all of this out, but I always try to, when I'm writing a scene or thinking of like what comes next, I know that this character, like, Silas, he's lived a long time, right? He's had a long life, a long career. When he's put in a situation, he's going to react very differently than someone like Kaya, who's young and hasn't really done anything yet.
Yeah.
So it's like, okay, you got to try to stay true to that. And I think I don't know where it originally came from, but I think I saw it in one of Brandon Sanderson's
those classes that he does for like UIU.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and he mentioned at some point that his world building, he looks at it like an iceberg. I kind of always kept that in the back of my mind, and I do my character development the same way. Like my characters are icebergs. Like what the reader sees is just the tip of like everything that they've experienced, and trying to always keep that in mind, like down to the what seemingly least significant character, I think is really where the secret sauce is.
For people who are not aware, Brandon Sanderson has this whole playlist of classes that he taught at BYU where he recorded them and just taught them out and put them out on YouTube for free. If you haven't seen them and you're interested in writing, check them out. They're really good, even beyond just fantasy and sci-fi, though they are really geared towards that. They're just fantastic for world building and writing, and even just like a primer into the writing industry in general. I watched them a few years ago, and I was like, this is the most amazing thing I could ever find on the internet. I was pretty excited about it.
No, they're super interesting. I would recommend checking them out. I mean, it's free, take all the information you can.
Exactly. I'm going to go on a little tangent now.
Sure.
Away from Vermilion Flames, but we're going to come back. So you said that you love time travel stories. So I got to ask you, like, what are some of your favorite ones? What are ones that you would suggest to people? Because time travel stories are really hard to do because they're so easy to be like, oh, time travel fixed it all.
Yeah. You know what? I think lately the ones I've liked more are where I guess they're more time loops than time travel per se.
I think that counts.
Like the what was when the I read one recently. It was the first 15 lives of Harry something or other.
Yes, I saw the title of that.
I feel really bad now. I don't remember the exact title, but
it's the first 15 lives of Harry August by Claire North.
Yes, that's the one. That was a very fun little novel, and it had a sort of very interesting take on the sort of time travel idea. Essentially, it's a character that's stuck in like a time loop, basically. But it's very clever, I thought.
I'll have to check that one out.
A Gift of Time, I think, was another one, which is sort of a similar sort of setup, where it's like a time loop type of thing. That's pretty cool. The Arthur C. Clarke books. Something I forget what
I'd say you're just ripping through these. I'm trying to make notes of them so I can look them up later.
I could send you some cliff notes later.
All right, I'll stop distracting you then. So talking about like the religion in the world and just all the complexities that are in there, bringing us back on subject.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the technology in your world, because this is a space opera. Space opera. We are in the future. We have space travel. We have all of this fantastical technology, but we also have these severe social, cultural limits on this technology. And I kind of wanted to know what was the inspiration behind that. Was it a mechanical choice, or was it something in the feel of the world that you had wanted to go for?
Yes. So essentially in the story, right, you have an old empire, right, that had existed before that was sort of, live in its golden age, right, with all of its amazing technology and all these advancements and everything. And you had a competing faction that ended up ultimately winning the war of ideas and literal war. And they kind of stepped backwards, right? They said this is too much development, we need to step things back. Essentially what you see now in the time of the narrative is sort of the effects of that, right? So now it's been a few hundred years, and things have just been deteriorating fairly quickly and slowly in some cases. So my sort of view on that was kind of like, if you look at like sort of the fall of the Roman Empire, right? And it never happened. It didn't happen overnight. It wasn't, they went from amazing, art and culture and everything to nothing, right? It's like it decays over time through the Middle Ages and beyond. So I wanted this world to kind of feel like that a little bit, where there's all these sort of echoes of amazing technology and such, but most of it like either doesn't work. There's people that don't really know how to fix it anymore. There's people that, just aren't allowed to, even if they do know how. Technology is super regulated, so, only so much of it gets out. And, obviously then social classes develop too from that, like, who gets access to what. And it's a very obscure reference too, but I'm a big fan of the Myst video games. So in those stories, essentially people are able to create worlds by writing the world out in a book. Through the narrative, you learn that there used to be an entire civilization of these people, right? They could write worlds and create worlds and do all these kind of amazing things until the civilization collapsed very suddenly. And it left only a couple of people that knew how to do this, like knew this skill any longer, right? On how to write these worlds. Just the idea of that, I've always found so incredibly moving, and like in its tragic nature and just emotionally, just everything about that has stuck with me since I've read that story. I think maybe wanted to capture a little bit of that too, where, and build on it, right? Like take those same ideas and just, make them bigger.
Yeah.
And apply them to our world in a way that, people maybe will recognize a little bit. And that was kind of my goal. I mean, I don't know how it's working out so far, but
I think it's working out pretty well, because now you have this blend of this Roman-inspired empire on this slow decline, but you also have a lot of remnants of this suddenly disappearing culture that they had destroyed in order to create their empire. So again, just like with so many other things in your book, you do this blend of, all right, we're going to do a little bit of this, but we're going to do a little bit of the opposite as well, because that's the way the real world works. It's more nuanced, it's complex, you have a lot of different things going on. How did you manage to keep all of that complexity like in the story while still progressing a narrative, revealing character backstory, and still introducing world building, all in a way that doesn't confuse the reader?
That was definitely a hard part. And, I'll admit, like in the early drafts, there was a lot more exposition that definitely got cut out later. But I think a lot of that too just kind of was sorted out as I got a little better with the actual craft. Again, just trying to explain things through the characters, right? So, and hinting at things when you can, right? So similar to the iceberg analogy, like I think part of it is you have to put a lot of faith in your readers, right? You need to assume that they can fill in some of the blanks, like when they're not explicitly stated, right? Most people are pretty smart. They can figure out all this stuff. If you lead them in the right direction. So, I went into it assuming that people like would get sort of like some of that nuance that, is hinted at, but then you add a bunch of layers too, right? And you build off of it. So, that was one thing I kept trying to do too, is, do things sort of like in steps, introduce something at one point, get a little bit further, reinforce it with something else. And then when it got time to actually like really use whatever that point was, like really driving home again a third time. So the repetition kind of came in a little bit too through just the narrative. But yeah, I mean, it was always a challenge, especially because I was trying to keep the length down a bit.
How long did the whole thing end up being?
I ended up at 120,000 words, which is really where I want it to be. It was kind of a little bit arbitrary, but everybody always talks about like, when they're giving new writers advice, they're like, oh, don't make your first book super long. I don't know. I just kind of took that to heart, I guess. And I was like, well, let me try to keep this kind of snappy, but also like I wanted, I didn't want to write like some crazy tome that like people had to sit with forever and read like, dozens of pages about, I don't know, something really esoteric about the culture. Like, I mean, I'd love to write it. That'd be awesome if people want to read it. Like, I'm happy to provide it for them. But, I know most people, they want a story, right? They want to be entertained. They want to feel some emotions and go on a ride. And so I tried to just, when in doubt, like when I thought things like were too slow or there was too much information or something else, I just reverted back to like, okay, like what can we have people doing? Like that's going to move the plot forward and be exciting for people to watch.
That advice is generally really good because you as a brand new author or as someone unknown to the reader, they don't know you, so They don't trust you yet. You have Brandon Sanderson. He has that buy-in from his readers already. They will churn through 100 pages before they enjoy a story because they know he's going to deliver. So there is always that advice to like new authors and debut authors just being like, hey, keep it a little shorter. Nice thing about fantasy and sci-fi, though, is we get a little more leeway. I think most other genres, the suggestion is like keep it between 70,000 and 90,000 words. But fantasy and sci-fi generally are beefier books compared to other genres, so our readers are expecting a beefier book. So that 120 is like perfectly within range.
I think so. Yeah, I mean, it worked out pretty well. I mean, there's definitely more I would have loved to put in the first book, I think. But I don't think it's missing anything that it needed. Well, for fans, though, that do like longer books, the second book is a bit longer, so...
Is there anything you can tell us about it? Not about like the plot or anything, not looking for spoilers, but like how is your process going with that? Are you past the first draft? What stage are you at on that?
Almost near the final editing stage, so we're getting pretty close. My goal is hopefully to have it out in the world by the end of September or so.
September of this year?
Sure, yeah. Maybe October.
Okay, I'm not going to hold you to that because I understand deadlines are difficult, especially with how slow a lot of publishing things move. But that is still very exciting. I wasn't expecting a new book this year, so that's very good to look forward to.
Yeah, we're pretty well on track. So, and I, not to my own horn, but I think it's pretty good. I think people are going to like it.
Awesome. I think that is a lovely space to call it because we're running low on time. Can you tell people where they can find your books or yourself on socials? And where can they find you?
Sure. So you can find all my books on Amazon. Also, as far as social goes, really Instagram's the best one for me. Adam Fernandez, author on Insta.
All right, folks, that is going to wrap up this episode of Author Adjacent. Thank you to Adam Fernandez for coming on to the show for this wonderful interview, and I am your host, Michael Vadney. If any of this was helpful to you or even just gave you a good chuckle, consider supporting the show by leaving a review on your podcast platform of choice or telling a friend about the show. For more Author Adjacent, you can follow me on X @AuthorAdjacent or shoot me an email at authoradjacent@gmail.com with your burning questions, comments, or topic ideas. New episodes drop every other week, so stay tuned. Now remember, the journey from writer to author might be long, but until then, let's be author adjacent together.